Welcome to the VR Report podcast. Today we have a special guest who's an expert in the world of photogrammetry, Oz Balabanian. With over a decade experience in this field, Oz is a visionary when it comes to blending the real and digital worlds and VR and AR experiences. He's the director of photogrammetry at Realities.io, where they also developed the sleeper hit, Puzzling Places, available on Meta's App Lab. So, what's photogrammetry? Photogrammetry is like going on a picture taking spree with your smartphone, except with selfies, you're capturing objects and turning them into 3D models. Now, you might be wondering, what does this mean for Apple's new headset, the Vision Pro? Well, with Apple's foray into spatial computing, photogrammetry is going to play a crucial role in shaping the future of VR and AR content. Get ready to get schooled on photogrammetry and immerse and its impact on Apple Vision Pro headset. Let's dive right in, friends. Here's Oz Balabanian. Hey, so for people that don't know you, you want to give a brief introduction, or you want me to give you one?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I didn't realize we're already going.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, happy to give myself an introduction. So yeah, I'm Azad Balabanian, sometimes known as Oz. I am currently working on a game called Puzzling Places. I'm one of 7 developers working on the game. It's a game about 3D jigsaw puzzling using photogrammetry scans from around the world. And it's one of the more liked games in the Quest store, as well as PlayStation and Pico and HTC Vive XR. Before that, I was doing a lot of photogrammetry and mixed reality, like green screen mixed reality video productions, trailers, commercials, things like that. And before that, I was all working at Upload VR on video production, live streaming. So yeah, that's kind of my work background, and I also studied cognitive science, doing human-computer interaction focus, like using VR. So that's kind of my intellectual background.
But Oz, you're probably also really well known regarding photogrammetry and what you've done in the space in VR specifically, because a lot of people, several years ago when you started, nobody was actually doing this that I know of personally. So. Can you speak more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely not nobody, but it was photogrammetry came out of both a academic world as well as an enterprise world. So academic because it was like a lot of archaeologists using photogrammetry to 3D scan their dig sites rather than doing measurements by hand and then drawings of their just like photographs of their dig sites. They started doing daily scans to get like really accurate measurements of the site. And then on the enterprise side, like photogrammetry is a cartography tool. It's a map making tool, surveying tool. So you could send a drone or a helicopter or a plane up in the air, take pictures of a site from, basically by doing like a lawnmower grid pattern, and from that create a 3D topology of the site. So that's also what's been used. That's how photogrammetry came about originally. I think 150 years ago, with using like blimps and balloons and stuff, people taking pictures from top down, and then looking at like similar features between two pictures and understanding like the difference between a feature between two pictures. So I kind of came around to using photogrammetry in probably early 2016, early 2017 as an interesting artistic tool of something that you can do in VR. Like I remember coming across a Reddit thread being like, what's something you can focus on in VR that's not just like software development? And this was one of the things that was suggested. And I remember kind of going down a rabbit hole. And then I spent a lot of time like trying to learn it and experimenting with it and realizing there's very little documentation and tutorials for photogrammetry. So I started making those, like writing guides, putting up YouTube videos. And so I have a YouTube channel with like a few tutorials that people seem to keep coming back to because they're just kind of evergreen content. And so that led me to working at Realities.io, my current job, where I'm the head of photogrammetry for Puzzling Places. So yeah, it's definitely a new field, like relatively within this sort of world that we're in, AR, VR, and software development, but it's an old technique, and only now is it becoming accessible enough that people like myself, like artists and creative, designers, could take it and play with it, experiment with it, and see what interesting things could come from it.
Yeah, I don't think it's also the accessibility, but I also think it's the technology that allows
Right.
people to have it be accessible. Like the first time I heard about games actually using photogrammetry was probably in 2015 with Star Wars Battlefront.
Yeah.
They wanted to, basically take photos and scan photos in 3 dimensions because that's the process. You're taking pictures at different angles and then cobbling it together.
Yeah.
And for gaming, that's the holy grail, right? You wanted things as realistic as possible. And Star Wars Battlefront was doing that not only for the props, but also some of the terrains from the actual sets from the movies.
Right.
But it's surprising to me that a lot of people don't still incorporate that into their game development pipeline. Why do you think that is today?
Yeah. One thing is knowledge for sure. Like just knowing how to do it is, of course, a barrier, and not like most 3D artists aren't familiar to scanning something. The second aspect that prevents everyone from using it is also that it doesn't work for everything, and it works great for wood materials and like flat materials, pillows, couches, things like that. But like metallic objects don't scan very well. Translucent objects don't scan very well. So there's a lot of material sort of limitations to what can be scanned. So I think for that reason, it can be in some cases it can be more of a pain in the ass to try to do that rather than trying to start from just like CG modeling and texturing that way. I think where the photogrammetry has like a massive advantage is for very organic things. So like Star Wars Battlefront, like they were scanning. I don't know if they scanned sets, but they certainly scanned like large rock formations, like parts of the environment that would be like very difficult to model, especially having like a lot of variation within the modeling. Maybe today it would be, with generative things, it could be a little bit easier to do, but also all those generative assets are coming from now photogrammetry models originally.
Mm.
So that work needed to be done. With props, I think one of the things that helped them with photogrammetry was that like you could have all this like wear and tear baked into the actual prop itself because it was like used on in the movie or on set or was created with that wear and tear. So scanning it meant it contained that wear and tear, and that's something on like the CG side there where you would need to kind of account for that. Like, everything in CG is typically very perfect, and what you would try to do, what you try to do with CG is you try to like make things dirty and gritty and imperfect, and scanning things in real life like has that baked in. So it's kind of
Yeah, that's
useful.
really a real eloquent way that you said that. In terms of the actual process for people that are new to this, like I think people conceptually understand, like, oh yeah, there's a lot of apps now that you can actually
Right.
capture 3D models, and of course, there's specific apps and platforms like Sketchfab that allow you to take photogrammetry and post them yourself. But for people who are new, walk them through the process of bringing your work in photogrammetry in VR. Maybe let's use a use case example because I know you traveled all over the world. Let's take for example, you know, uh, some of the ruins that you've captured. Can you
Sure.
walk people through, kind of paint the picture from start to finish?
Yeah, and kind of a precursor to that is a lot of CG artists and like 3D artists use photogrammetry to create like capture assets and use them in a CG environment. My approach is typically much more of a photographer's angle, which is like let's try to capture a scene, a beautiful scene as is, not to be used in like a game or a movie per se, but as a 3D photograph, as a volumetric photograph, and so that's always been my interest in the field. But I'm happy to kind of like generalize describing it. So the general process of photogrammetry is quite simple, which is if you have an object, let's say, okay, a Quest controller, and you want to 3D scan this so that you can have like a perfect 3D model of it. And let's say it's not just purely white; it has like marks and whatnot all over it because purely white objects or things don't scan very well because they don't have any features for the surface reconstruction step to work very well. So you would essentially place it on a pedestal somewhere, and then with a camera start to take pictures from a 360-degree perspective, so all the way around, but then also try to cover the height. So do another 360 pass this way and another one here. So you try to really capture all the perspectives of an object that you can. Then you feed it into a photogrammetry software. Typically, you would use like something like reality capture or Metashape, and that's those software take the images, they find features, that's like feature detection, that's looking for unique high contrast pixels, let's say. So that's why something white doesn't have such high contrast pixels. But for something like this rug below me has like beautifully high contrast edges. So it finds those features, and then it compares those features with the features it found with every other picture. From that can triangulate where each picture was taken from, which is kind of like magic. Actually, it's like, I know it's kind of basic math if you really look at the underlying algorithms, but when you see that, like, oh, it can actually understand where the cameras were when the object was being scanned, like that feels like magic when you see it. And as a tangent, this is also how 6DoF like tracking works, whether it's your Quest or your phone doing mobile AR. It's basically per frame looking at features in the camera view and understanding that, like, oh, you moved your phone here and the perspective changed, and compared to the previous frame, like this is what the perspective is, and so it knows that the phone or your Quest moved in that direction, but it's just doing it in real time and like much less features. But with photogrammetry, you don't have to do it in real time, and you can use a lot more features, which means your tracking can be like really accurate. And then after that, you can create a surface reconstruction of the object that's the object of interest. And the final step is the texturing, which is the blending of all the colors from each camera, from each image onto the mesh. So it projects, kind of like projection mapping, like you would see on like a church or something with a projector outside. People are like projection mapping onto the surface, but imagine that from every single perspective and all those colors being blended. So that's where you get the photorealistic kind of look to the object. It's because the final texture is a blend of all the images. Yeah.
That's cool. That was perfect. I think I wanted to give you a little clap soundtrack there, trying out some of these tools.
That's hilarious.
Anyways, that was cool. So I know you went to UC Santa Cruz because that's where we met up, when I realized you moved back to the Bay at the Silicon Valley Virtual Reality Meetup, SVVR. Tell me a little bit more about why photogrammetry and why VR, considering that all the steps that you laid out, I think a lot of that goes away with AI, right? And I'm sure that there's a lot more smart people than I am kind of working on that stuff. Right. What do you think AI will do in terms of photogrammetry, in terms of accessibility, ease of use? And then second, why VR? I mean, because you had mentioned, you were interested in VR other than just, 3D modeling, but because you have a photography background, that's why you would want to bring. But why VR and why photogrammetry?
Yeah, I think they're kind of independent of technologies of each other, but they have like a huge overlap, which that overlap is very interesting. And that's also why I've been involved in both. So my interest in both kind of camps are separate, but their overlap is interesting. So why VR? So VR was really interesting to me because in 2015 and 2016, it was very clear that this is like the next paradigm of computing, and from the design perspective, there was so much room to explore in terms of like just human computer interaction. Like what are buttons supposed to be like? How do you interact with anything? What software design looking like in VR? So and that's still a huge open field, and so that's why it's still very exciting compared to mobile or whatever. Like mobile design, it's like, okay, how many ways can you design a hamburger menu? I don't know. Sure, there's new things
Eight
that come
times.
about. 8 times for sure, and you have hundreds of designers that fight over the color of the transition color of that. But with VR, it's just like such a huge open field. So that was my interest in it. With photogrammetry, yeah, I came from a photography and video production background as well as a hobbyist, and it kind of caught my attention as like, oh, this is a new art medium. Like this is a new art genre of photography. How does where does this fit? What can I do to figure out like in which use cases is this genre like does it shine in compared to the other ones? So one interesting application of the when you combine the two is 3D scanning an entire a scene rather than an individual asset is that you can actually explore that place in VR. So let's say you can scan this room, which you can using DSLRs or like a LiDAR scanner on the higher end. You can actually have a really accurate 3D reconstruction and representation of the room that you can walk in one-to-one scale in VR. So one-to-one scale, of course, that's like realistic and that's kind of cool. You can pitch that as like a virtual tourism use case or from like a real estate tourism or real estate use case. Actually, on that end, when we were moving into this apartment, I had done a quick polycam scan of the apartment viewing, and polycam also produces the blueprint of the place that you're scanning, like one of
I
the
didn't know
room.
that. That's cool.
Yeah, it's actually an API that Apple made and put out there, just kind of like, hey, people figure out what you want to use it for, and from that I was able to like have the place in Blender, and then we were like customizing it, putting IKEA furniture in different places, and then in VR actually walking around and kind of like figuring out the sight lines from the house. And I realized at some point that the couch that we had in the living room, like when you entered the house or the apartment, you saw the back of the couch rather than, and I realized I don't like that. I want to flip it around so that you see the people sitting on the couch and you have like a nice interaction. So it's these sort of things that VR can really excel in. And so photogrammetry like kind of fits perfectly into that. What else?
AI.
The,
What happens now with all those steps that you mentioned, which made it very inaccessible? It's also
right.
very expensive, right? Because you got to get the hardware. But the stitching together, does that all go away with AI?
The stitching, so okay. I guess with AI, the way where AI intersects with all this stuff is, I think the most interesting aspect is neural rendering, aka NeRFs. That's kind of like a paper that came out a couple of years ago called neural radiance fields, and that now has spawned its own genre of research in this like field of taking pictures of the real world and then creating a 3D like photorealistic 3D representation with like novel views basically. NeRFs are the next generation of photogrammetry. It's built upon photogrammetry's like steps. So it's still technically you're still doing structure for motion, which means you're still looking for features in each picture or each frame of a video, and you're still understanding how the camera moved, so that you have a basic understanding of the scene and the camera, and so that when you do project, let's say colors or textures, like what that is supposed to look like. But that those later steps of like the surface reconstruction or the texture projection, that stuff is now changing with NeRFs in basically how it looks at the very end, rather than creating just triangles for the surface reconstruction. You have well, I don't really know what they are. Maybe they're like signed distant fields, but like, basically it's much more of a blurby, dreamy like state that NeRFs are. They're
Hmm.
not rasterized
It's kind
like.
of like a mid-journey rendering,
Yeah, that's kind
psychedelic,
of interesting.
dreamy.
Wait, yeah, it's like Midjourney compared to like, I don't know, something very
Right.
vector
Yeah, yeah.
art, and so like that's what NeRFs are to photogrammetry.
Cool.
And NeRFs really do benefit from like a lot of the limitations that photogrammetry have, which is photogrammetry scanning like has trouble reconstructing things that are further away. Like typically when you scan a building with a drone, like the surroundings don't look very good because you didn't really focus on trying to take pictures of the surrounding. With NERFs, like kind of the surroundings that you have in the background of the picture of each picture kind of come for free, and you can have like a really large scale surrounding as well as the sky. If you end up taking pictures of the sky, like that all gets contained in the scene. So it creates like a much more of a holistic reconstruction. So that's really nice. That's something that I've wanted with photogrammetry to improve upon. And it turns out like NERFs or like neural rendering was the where things needed to go for that to happen. Then you have translucency, transparency, like things that are typically called like view dependent effects. So if you have like some the ground is wet, so of course it reflects the world from the puddle.
Mm-hmm.
With photogrammetry, like it can't account for different. If you look at the puddle from different angles, like it looks very different.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really know what to do with that. Like at best, if the puddle is actually very sharp, then you could create like a mirror world underneath the puddle. That's like the mirror of the thing. That's also still happens with NERFs, but point being that like transparent and translucent objects can be reconstructed with NERFs much better than you can with photogrammetry. Likewise with some surfaces that don't do well with photogrammetry. So NERFs are really building upon all the limitations that exist with 3D scanning, and visually at the very end, they also look much more photorealistic. They have some drawbacks, which is their performance is like a big issue. You can't run them in real time the same way that you can like very optimized photogrammetry meshes. You can say that's like a matter of just time that it changes, in the same way that it's almost like Moore's law that now that there's so much attention put into it, people are starting to write publish papers that are focusing on about optimizing the real time rendering of things. There's other limitations like the surface the surface geometry of NERFs aren't like very solid. They're not very clean, so you can't use them in the same way that photogrammetry scans can. Like I 3D print my photogrammetry scans as like sculptures. Like that would be a lot harder to do with NERFs, or at least like they can be more noisy that way. But those things are also starting to change. Like NVIDIA just published something called Neural Angelo, not Michelangelo, but it's like a play on that. And it's basically combining the benefits of photogrammetry and NERFs, where you have like the really nice surface reconstruction of photogrammetry, but with the visual enhancements of NERF on top. So I think, yeah, even as this podcast goes out, it will likely be outdated. Like that's kind of the pace of research that's coming out. And I'm definitely behind in terms of where NERFs are, just because my job currently is so focused on photogrammetry. But it's something really important to keep your eye on as a layman or someone in the field.
That's cool. That's cool. So, getting back to some of the projects that you're currently working on, there's Puzzling Places, which I think has a really awesome backstory.
Oh, yeah.
For those that don't know, it's taking your photogrammetry creations.
And not mine, not just
they're
mine.
not all yours.
There's a
Okay.
few of mine, but it's some scans that we've done as a company, some that we've done as individuals within the team, but as well as a lot of photogrammetry partners that we've created partnerships with and are licensing their pre-existing scans.
That's cool, because Realities.io, they do a lot of agency work. You guys done stuff for Audi, but basically, you guys are doing that as a service.
Yep.
And how did you come up with the idea one day? I mean, I know of it. I think people that don't know, I think that would be a really interesting backstory of, first of all, what Puzzling Places is. Let's first describe that. Sure. It's an awesome, fun, wholesome game. I've read that as being described as your puzzling game. And basically it's putting together puzzle pieces like jigsaw pieces, but in 3D of these photogrammetry scans.
Right.
I'm sure you can do a lot better job than I can. But yeah, please let people know about the backstory and the origin story based on that.
Sure. Yeah, you pretty much nailed it. It was as most things go, it was a bug turned into a feature, which turns out it's like a really good way to discover really interesting things. One day like 5 years ago or something, we had imported a 3D scan, like a really large scale 3D scan that we had done for a client into Unity. And typically the way we structure our large scale scans is we cut them up into smaller tiles, like smaller chunks. And so during import, somehow all of the pieces got jumbled up. So like all the tiles were in incorrect places. And one of the engineers who has a game design background, and he's always thinking about the kind of interesting interactions. His name's Shaw. He was like, guys, it would be kind of interesting if we just shipped it like this as a joke to the client and just told them to basically puzzle it together in VR using your controllers. And then he thought about it for another moment, and he's like, that's actually would be pretty cool. And so he took it upon himself to prototype it over a weekend, and he actually built something really cool, like a very simple prototype, but it proved the idea to us and to our friends that were around that wanted to play it, that like this is a cool idea, and it's something that we can do with any photogrammetry scan as long as we cut it into pieces and create pieces, puzzle pieces out of them. It's kind of an interesting interaction, but that kind of laid dormant for a little while because we weren't a game company. We weren't like game designers, or also weren't the business of realities wasn't game development. So that all changed really around when COVID hit, and a lot of these projects that we were working on fell through, and that opened up all of our time to basically work on something new. One of the engineers was working on puzzling places as like side projects. And it would also come up over the years. We would do like smaller hackathons based on it, like try to add this, try to add that. Like, what's interesting? Should we add voiceover when you finish part of a puzzle? Like, it starts to talk and tell you about that place. So little experiments like that, but we had never really taken it on as like the main project until COVID. And during COVID, we decided that we should really develop this out and we weren't doing anything else that was like pressing. And we also decided that we should put a prototype on SideQuest, which at the time in 2019, there was very little content on the Quest. The Quest had just come out in 2019. And so by early 2020, there were still just a few games on the store. So all the Quest owners were hungry for content, and so they started flocking to like a secondary app store called SideQuest, and you had to like sign up as a developer and like sideload apps and all this stuff. But people were willing to do it because they wanted more things to do. And so we basically rode that wave and published a vertical slice of the game, like a single puzzle, a really good, solid, beautiful puzzle with like really nice audio and sound design, just to see what people would think about it. We needed some real world validation in case we wanted to like seek investment or publishing deals for the game. And so we put it out there. It got quite a lot of attention, thankfully. Tons of people on Reddit, like VR Media basically also saw it and picked up on it. And they were like, this is a cool idea. We've never really seen anything like it. Like, there have been puzzles in VR. They've been photogrammetry in VR, but like it hadn't really been put together. And it gave us like a huge amount of boost and encouragement to continue developing the game. And so then there was a long journey for actually getting the game to come out on the Quest, through like multiple rejections, and then also Sony coming up and offering us a PlayStation VR porting deal, which was honestly really a big boost to us as well, to being able to survive and continue developing the game. And at the end, we were able to launch Puzzling Places, the full game, in September of 2021. So it's been out for about a year and a half now, almost 2 years. And it was ranked as the highest rated Quest game for the full year, and maybe even a year and a couple of months.
Sorry, I just had to do that again.
And it's, like, as you said, it's a very wholesome game because it's, even though you're in VR, it's very much about places around the world. So it's trying to show people like beautiful places from countries that they've never been to or even have heard of in some cases. Like, their cultural heritage, their sites, their interesting areas that you just have maybe seen in pictures, but they have never like experienced like a 3D model of. And it also plays upon the idea of like miniatures. Like people really like to look at like 3D models. I mean, like kind of tabletop models of places. That's the feeling that you get as you're building these 3D jigsaw puzzles. And the sound design really also creates this like beautifully atmospheric environment where as you continue finishing this puzzle, you start to hear the little like world inside of this miniature come to life, like whether it's cars on the street or bikes or like little bells being rung. It's just like a really delightful little wholesome experience. So we attract like a really wide range of players, thankfully, rather than like a shooter or whatnot.
That's right. And I think it's something that I think in social, if multiplayer or at least sharing, I think that's going to be really powerful. I see a future where people are going to be scanning everything, just like Scaniverse with your phone. And I think
Right.
sharing vacation photos will never be boring because you'll be able to play them with friends and
Right.
family. In terms of the next steps, I mean, let's talk about Apple Vision Pro because I think that headset, in terms of the resolution of the lenses, you're going to be able to get so much more detail. And I think that's the delight of puzzling places, that you get to actually play with these 3D models, like you said, like a diorama or a little miniatures that you get to put together. It's very intimate. But
Yeah.
with the higher resolution Vision Pro headset, I think that's also going to change the game. How do you see Apple Vision Pro and photogrammetry coming together? What are some of your predictions? What do you think are going to be cool use cases?
Yeah. It's so Apple actually has its own photogrammetry SDK that they released, I think maybe 1 or 2 years ago now. And it's they basically want, rather than like you having to use a paid tool for it, like basically put out an SDK, giving it to third party developers, being like integrate this into your own apps and figure out what people are going to use it for. So obviously they were thinking about like people wanting to, like both developers and users using it to create like scanning assets or like scanning their rooms, scanning interesting places to see or to be in VR. And I think that kind of pipeline works perfectly well. In fact, this year they even announced that photogrammetry SDK to run locally on a phone. So whereas before people had to upload the pictures to a cloud instance, or it basically was running on a Mac somewhere, whether that was local on your MacBook or your Mac Studio, or it was running on someone's cloud instance. Now, as of I guess iOS 17, that photogrammetry SDK can run on the phone. That's on top of also the LiDAR unit that they had added to the last couple of years of Pro model iPhones, where you don't even have to do photogrammetry. You could like use the LiDAR scanner to get the 3D, like the geometry of the scene or the object, and then project the textures onto. So that process is really quick, but the quality is less than what you'd get with photogrammetry. So with Apple Vision Pro, I think obviously they wanted to create like a really their first step into spatial computing to show people like this is a useful tool for you to do work in. Like you can sit down with your mouse and keyboard or your MacBook or even either without that, you can sit down with your eyes and your fingers and be able to do what you would typically do with a personal computer. Where photogrammetry fits into that is, well, I don't know, like it's like you can think of it like a picture. Like how are pictures or images, JPEGs, being used in computers today? It's like it's a way of transmitting information about the real world or about screenshots of things that you're working on. And so photogrammetry is probably like the next step, the next generation of that, which is like a 3D version of it. So whether that's 3D pictures of the room that you're in that you could actually maybe use as a virtual environment. So you could, be on a plane, but still feel like you're at home and or like you're at a beach or whatever, something more interesting than your typical office. Or you could use it to, they showcase like sending 3D models back and forth on iMessage, which has existed for the last few years with their USDZ format. But, I don't think I've ever really used that because there wasn't really a good reason to look at things like that on my phone. But I would imagine with my headset, it would be just nice to have like a scan that I would, something that I would scan with my phone and then send it to my friend in an Apple Vision Pro, and them being able to download it, look at the miniature of it, and then blow it up to be like life size. I think it's, to be honest, like the how everything comes together is not really that clear to me, and I think they also know that. I think this whole first Apple Vision Pro, at least the first 2 or 3 generations, will be about experimentation. Will be about like people trying to figure out what this technology is good for. I'm curious about what their spatial photos and their spatial videos kind of feature is actually made from. Like that was their memories sort of section of the keynote that they showed off, that with the headset you actually can kind of capture like a first person perspective of a scene or of an event happening, and then the playback of that in VR is supposed to be like very lifelike, almost like you're watching a memory. And it's not very clear if that was just like a stereoscopic video that was being captured with like 2 cameras on the headset, or it's much more of a 6 DOF volumetric capture. But that's kind of where it can also fit into. It could be like the backdrop of a spatial capture video playback, but rather than just limited to that perspective, that was the camera recording like the people in like the birthday scene. But say you could actually use your phone to capture the scene around it, and so you have like a very Minority Report, like you're walking around the scene and seeing this like volumetric playback of the birthday scene happening. So I think that those are all like the columns that are being laid upon, and it's not really clear what that platform is going to be built, like what it's going to look like in 5 years or even 10 years. But all the important pieces are here now, and it's just about putting it together and creating like an experience. I think Puzzling Places is a good example of something that wasn't clear 10 years ago, that this would be a use case of photogrammetry, that in fact, you would just use the scan, cut into pieces, and you to tell people to put it back together. And that's like a really interesting use case of it, and much more engaging than just looking at a photogrammetry scan. I think similarly with these next generation headsets, like we're not really sure where how things are going to be useful, but developers will be clever to figure that out.
Yeah, that's pretty thought provoking. That was cool. Apple has been positioning it as a 3D camera, but yeah, it could just be stereoscopic. They don't give any details, right? But I do remember some people checking out the Alicia Keys. I don't know if it was an interview or no. It was a performance, and a lot of people got that visceral reaction. And I think it's more than stereoscopic 3D, but again, no details. I can only speculate.
Yeah, I think they had multiple things that they showed that like they didn't make distinctions on, but if you kind of read in between the lines, you could understand. So the Alicia Keys, I believe it was a using their Next VR. So they come.
Oh,
they
so it's a
acquired
Next
a
VR
company.
rig that they use?
Exactly.
Okay.
So Next VR was a 360 filmmaking camera producer. So yeah, stereoscopic 360, and they really focused on sports, and I think they focused on like live events and music. And supposedly, like the journalists that got the 30-minute demos, they also got a preview of like courtside basketball game in 360, and I think Alicia Keys might have been the other aspect as well. And so those were like traditional stereoscopic 360 videos, which maybe could also be expanded to be more 6 degrees of freedom rather than just like stuck 360. Then they showed the spatial photos and video, which that's probably the biggest unknown in terms of like what technologies are being used there. My guess is that it's stereoscopic plus like real kind of like, it's like RGBD. So, you have like the real depth and the video kind of projected on top of that. And so you maybe have a little bit of room to wiggle around your head, some parallax, but it's not like a fully volumetric video. And then the other thing they also showed was stereoscopic movie playback, and also in high frame rate. So things like Avatar 2, which are stereoscopic, it's a stereoscopic movie, but also has high frame rate. So I don't know if it's 60 FPS or 120 FPS, but that's something that actually hasn't existed outside of movie theaters. Like I missed it. I actually didn't see Avatar 2 in theaters, unfortunately. And I know even on like the best 4K Blu-ray print that they'll be putting out, it won't be high frame rate video. It'll only be stereoscopic or in HDR. So these are things that Apple's really pushing on. And like me as like a film nerd and like a home theater nerd, like they're actually pushing on specs that I never expected them to, because it's like a very nerdy thing. And I was really happy to see that.
That's cool. Thanks for that insight. Yeah, I forgot that Next VR they got acquired by Apple, so that would make sense.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of going back to puzzling places, since you kind of mentioned it, as a developer, when I was working at Meta, I heard the same story. Like people would call me like, Dave, like why can't I get my app through the App Store? Like why this rigmarole? And it was really frustrating for me working there because I also knew some of the constraints. Basically there's only so many titles that can be supported throughout the year. And App Lab just kind of
Right.
became this place where we can't support all these developers. Let's just create a whole little space that they can self-govern. But I don't think the approach was right because a lot of people got frustrated. A lot of people got like, not the greatest feedback. And it was a lot of frustration from the developer community. Tell me about your experience developing and developing for Quest specifically and getting onto App Lab and being one of the most highest rated games on App Lab.
Right. I think the problem from Meta's side, from Oculus's side, is something I can be like I'm very much sympathetic to, because they realize that if they have an open app store like Play Store, or even let's say Apple's iOS store, then you have a race to the bottom in terms of pricing, which means everyone tries to put out free games and have premium add-ons or like subscriptions and whatnot, and that might work well in some regard or in some apps, but like traditionally gamers are not so happy with freemium games, like especially pay to win sort of mechanics. So if they hunkered down and created a very console like app store or game store where they had like really good tight controls, or that like every single thing you can buy in the store, it'll be high quality, it'll run at full frame rate, and it'll be fun, of course, because that's like it's a game app store, so it needs to be fun. They wanted to have a very good curated site, and also I think from a developer support perspective, that meant you could assign like a single account manager to each game and or to each company, and like have like real support from a developer relations perspective, rather than having like a huge thing. So I totally get that, and I think that decision obviously is a double-edged sword. So like you're kind of doomed if you do, doomed if you don't. And the problem obviously became like, if they needed to have a curated store, then they were pretty much gonna trust only developers that have a proven track record of shipping games before. So that's like very traditional game developers, rather than VR developers or like smaller indie studios. And traditional game developers haven't done so well in VR. They like, the game mechanics that they're using, or the game ideas that they have, either haven't been adapted to VR well, or don't really adapt well, or they just don't have like, they haven't put in the amount of time and care that you need to build something from the ground up for VR. So that's why like the most popular games currently in VR are all from new companies, new VR developers that have started from zero for VR. Rather than, like, there's a few exceptions like Skyrim, but even that you can point to say like, look how long they worked on trying to like build that out, and you can even argue that like they built upon mods that were built for that that were doing that. So I think the people that were like really curating the store like they had to go with very low risk titles, and so new developers like us that were coming in the scene, even though we weren't new into VR, new to developing VR, but new in VR games, like didn't have that pedigree that we can lean on and be like, oh, we've shipped this game, we shipped that game, we will definitely ship this third game if you give us an okay. It wasn't even a publishing deal. There was no money being promised from like Oculus's end for us to develop and ship. So that's where things got difficult, because like we had a good idea. We even had real world validation with the side quest demo that like, hey, look, we have a ton of players that not only love the game, play the game. Here's what the retention numbers look like, but even through they even paid for extra content for the game through Patreon. Like as we were developing the game, we had a testing platform through Patreon where people paid on a weekly or monthly basis and got like new smaller puzzles to play and test with. And so that had a very proven track record of like revenue generation, on a recurring monthly, a recurring revenue, which is like what people love to see. And even then we had a very tough time getting the green light to launch in the store. So App Lab came around to kind of help alleviate that, and I think if side quests didn't exist for the Quest, I don't think App Lab would have existed, because Oculus, to their credit, they saw side quests, they saw that it was like actually working really well, and apparently they were like 1 in 3 Quest players at some point had side quests installed, and so they realized like this is a big deal. And also to their credit that like they allowed this to happen, right? They even allowed paid games to exist on SideQuest, and they still do. Whereas Apple would have shut that down by now. Like imagine trying to distribute a game or something through test flight. Like they have a limit to how many people can download that for a specific reason, because they don't want a competing app store. But Meta saw SideQuest as not like a main competitor, but they realized that this is helping their retention numbers. With their Quest users in general, and probably leading to them, staying on the App Store more and buying games from their own store. So App Lab came around for that to be like an official endorsement, let's say, of SideQuest, because it was built in partnership with them, even though it was a separate entity. But you can't really make that much money from App Lab. Then that's like the reality of it. If you're not going to get featured on the front page of the store, and you're like hidden as an unlisted link in the store, there's nothing there. So even though we were on App Lab, we still focused on like trying to market ourselves through SideQuest and through SideQuest's store, and also market like individually. Like we were doing all the marketing ourselves, and we still do, through our own social media sites and through Reddit. So yeah, I think it just falls upon developers to have to like do everything here, developing and publishing and marketing, and as indie development kind of goes these days. But in return, you also are not selling the IP rights to the game to a publisher, and if it does really well, then you get to keep that at least that 70% of the revenue that the game generates. So
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that's right. I think cutting them some slack. It's tough to be able to have a whole bunch of excited developers get onto the platform. I think you're right. They took the right steps to not squash side quests, but I think that would have just been detrimental to them, because
Right.
the hardcore VR heads would be just like, what the hell?
Yeah.
And I think that was something that they actually did really right. But in terms of being a game developer today, you touched upon 3 things. Being indie, you got to do your own marketing. You've got to then figure out how to even get your own feedback, because you're publishing the game, and then you also got to worry about keeping the lights on. And besides those 3 major problems, can you tell me like what else a game developer who may be new to XR, and they're now thinking about XR considering Apple's new announcement, and the Quest Pro looks really cool. What advice do you have for them?
One piece of advice is like developing. We at very early on we had to decide, okay, is this going to be a Quest game or is this going to be a PCVR game? And I'm so happy that we picked kind of the most compute constrained platform to begin on, because that meant if it can run on a Quest 1, then it can run on any other platform if we decide to port to it afterwards. If it can run on a phone, they can definitely run on a computer, not like natively, but But if you build for a PC, then it's not like it's going to be compute limited. That's one aspect that was very difficult that we saw for other developers that started on as a Rift game and then had to port it to Quest, which was like, oh my God, like they built all the, like everything for PC, the visuals and everything, then got a downgrade when they came to the Quest. So for us, it was the opposite. It started with Quest, and every platform that we decide to support from here on out can, it'll look better. It could probably run at a higher resolution, higher refresh rate, or even more pieces. Like with the PlayStation VR 2 release, we had a 1,000 piece exclusive puzzle because it was a PSVR 2. You could actually run, like, it had a much beefier CPU than the Quest 2 or even the PSVR 1 did. So that's something that really helped us. And if it's something, for new developers, like how they should approach it, definitely try to like approach it from the most performance perspectives, because that might give you the best options moving forward. In that regard, also keeping costs low is like super, super important. Thankfully, the founders of Realities, even though they founded the company here in the Bay Area, they were German, and so they took the company and the whole project basically to Berlin and set up shop there, and were able to keep costs more manageable that way there. And also, the team never got bloated. They never tried to hire a ton of people and just to kind of fill in those positions. Like, keep this team small. It also keeps the iteration loops much quicker, and less bureaucratic overhead. And in the beginning, it was like really important to be able to jam on ideas and to play test things. I think that's, like probably being in a physical space together really helps early on, especially early on. Maybe later on, like right now, we're all remote, but that's because we're in a groove together. We know what to do. We know the release cadence of things. But early on, like being together was super important. Apart from that, I think starting with Quest is still really, really advisable. That's still where you're going to make like the grand majority of the money for a game. So if you're building something new, definitely start with Quest. I don't know how that equation changes with the Vision Pro launching next year. I suspect, to be honest, that it won't change all that much, at least in the first year or two.
Yeah, because who's going to have headsets, right? 3,500
Exactly.
bucks, right? And it's a dev kit, so you should be a developer, right?
Yeah. But I think they'll sell a good amount of headsets, and word, like rumor has it that their production is going to be limited by their displays. Like for them to be able to create those like
Right. I
super
saw that.
dense
Yeah.
displays, it's apparently they have like really bad yields, and they're just going to be production constrained. So it's gonna be a while until the Vision Pro is like a massive thing, and as it is with every new platform, it takes typically 3 or 4 generations for it to really be like, the iPhone 4 was like the main thing that like if you knew people that were buying iPhones, it was typically the iPhone 4. Apple Watch, same thing, was like the 4th generation is when it really sort of took off. iPad, I think, was similar. So I would probably advise like focus on Quest, definitely develop for Quest. Obviously think about some of the features that the Vision Pro offers, like eye tracking and hand tracking, and think about how that fits into whatever you're developing. I think that also opens things up a little bit wider than beyond gaming, which most of VR has only been focusing on gaming. I think to its detriment, unfortunately, but I also don't blame developers for focusing on that, because like productivity hasn't worked very well in VR, mostly because of screen resolution and comfort not being there. So now that those things are kind of getting there, I think thinking about applications beyond just gaming is starting to become realistic. But the same, again, the performance limitations and whatnot are still the same, whether it's a game or a productivity app. Focus on Quest. Try to keep it performance limited. Make it look good.
Keep
If you
costs
can
down,
keep
pay the
costs down.
bills. Yeah.
If it can look good on a Quest 1, then or like Quest 2, then it's going to look even better on like the next generation platforms. That I think that really helped. That worked very well for us. And try to do it in real, like if you're working with someone else, try to work together, because I think in person, I mean, or nearby, because that iteration loop is just going to be that much quicker than trying to do it all remote from the start.
That's great advice for new devs focusing or interested in VR. This now brings us to almost at the end of the segment. I'm going to ask you 5 questions, right?
Ooh.
And you're going to answer them as succinctly and honestly and quickly as possible and all that good stuff. So the first one, right? Oculus Quest versus Sony, development-wise, who do you prefer?
Working with Sony has been awesome. They've been really nice, like in terms of the developer relations, like that's been really good. Their backend is kind of annoying as hell because it's just like super convoluted. So Meta's backend is way easier to work with. In terms of actual development work, I think also the Quest is more considerably easier. But we're an Unreal game, and all of Meta's new features like their avatars and even eye tracking for the Quest Pro was just like Unity only. So that meant we couldn't use all the cool new stuff. So kind of a toss up there.
That's great segue. Unity, Unreal for first time game developers. What do you say?
Probably Unity, just because you just have way more documentation there that's for you to follow as a developer. And I think ChatGPT would probably also do a better job, like scripting C#, writing code in C# for you, and to help you debug things for Unity rather than Unreal. But yeah, that's just my experience on personal development.
Fantastic. So Apple coming into the race, are you going to be bringing Puzzling Places as a first port on Apple Vision Pro for developers? Should you jump on this, yay or nay?
We definitely have a desire for it. We haven't heard anything about an Unreal Engine support yet because of the massive Tim Sweeney versus Tim
Lawsuits
Cook.
kind of stall things, right?
Yeah, it kind of soured that whole relationship. So if they can figure out some, how to bridge that gap, then yeah, we'll absolutely be happy to be there when the Vision Pro launches.
Pico, no go. What are your thoughts on Pico?
Pico's cool. They help developers port their games to there, with development costs and whatnot. So anything that can bring in some money to help you stay afloat, I think is a win on my end. So if a developer comes to you, hey, or if a VR headset comes to you and says port this over to our platform, you say, how much are you willing to pay, and can you send me a dev kit? So do that basically.
Awesome. Zuck or Cook, who would win in a fight?
Zuck for sure. Yeah,
His MMA skills. Right?
Zuck's a beast. I mean, that's pretty clear. By now, right?
Cool. Oz, this was fantastic, man. I wish we got to talk more about how we met, upload days, which a lot of people don't know, which was really fun and such a historic time. I know that, where can people reach you at? I mean, your podcast, one of my favorite podcasts about VR, actually one of the things that I really enjoy listening to, you sunsetted that. Why? I mean, I know we're going a little bit over here.
Sure. I mean, it was just time. It was something that I started back when I was still in college, and I was more up to date when it came to like science behind VR. Like so it's called Research VR, and it was about like the science behind virtual reality, specifically like the cognitive science and whatnot, and how it related to design. But it also kind of built into its own like enterprise focused VR aspect, where I was like interviewing founders and developers and engineers about like basically peeling back the curtain on the work that they're doing, just because I saw so much interesting stuff happening, whether that was just like in Twitter threads or in blog posts, and I wanted that to live in an audio format. But yeah, I think I did it for 5 years with my co-host, Peter. And I think also I just needed to work on other things after a certain amount of time. And I obviously, I still like podcasting. I still like talking. And every once in a while, I also make a new YouTube video. But if I were to come back to podcasting, it would probably be in a slightly different format with maybe a different focus. So yeah, maybe we'll make a Research VR podcast version 2.0 at some point.
That'd be so cool. How can people find you?
Sure. Best way is through Twitter. I'm at Azadux, Azadux, and yeah, find me and my tweets there.
Oz, you're the best, man. It was great hanging out
Thanks,
with
David.
you the other
Yeah,
night,
likewise.
and hope to do it soon now that you're back in the Bay.
Absolutely. I'm hoping for more Bay Area VR events, just more VR like events in general, and like anywhere in the US and Europe, just because that used to be a huge cultural touch point for people like us, like nerds like us that wanted to be in this. And of course VR costs, like the headsets cost a lot of money, so these meetups end up being like a really important cultural event for people that want to kind of get themselves involved, and because that's definitely how I got into this. So I hope there's more of that, and I hope you're involved in organizing them and keeping them
Oz,
going,
yeah,
David.
totally. You got me inspired, man. That was great.
Thanks.
Cool. Oz, thank you so much. And, see you on the other side.